Hello, welcome to this series of interviews with cybersecurity experts at Cyen. I'm Iva Tasheva, your host, and today we have the honor to welcome Anne Leslie. Hello, Anne.
Hi, Eva. Delighted to be with you.
Anne is a cloud risk and controls leader for Europe at IBM. As you could imagine, we have a lot in common. We are both interested in cloud security, but also controls, compliance. This comes by definition, but also we would discuss today DORA and cyber resilience, objectives, challenges, and opportunities. But before we start on cyber resilience, we all have this kind of perception of what the objective is, but it's sometimes difficult to touch, difficult to confirm. What is it, cyber resilience, and how does it relate to the financial stability?
So big topic. So cyber resilience, it's dealt with at multiple layers, right? So it's dealt with by supranational bodies like the G20, like the Financial Stability Board, and it kind of cascades down. And it actually ends up cascading right down to individuals, like people like you and me in our day-to-day lives. And I think that's what's really important for people to understand, is that it's not a massive big topic that is only the preserve of other people doing other things far away from us. Yes, it is. But it essentially boils down to building up capabilities to protect electronic data resources, electronic systems, the things that we rely on to do so many things day to day. We could be talking about energy and utilities, telecoms, health, financial services, and banking. So much of our lives is now digital that when we're looking at cyber resilience, it's all of the capabilities taken as a whole that protect. And if there is some kind of an attack or an outage, that we have the ability to respond and recover and get back to steady state operations where people can go about their lives securely and do the things that we all want to get done.
To me, it also relates to the fact that security is your own concern. So you need to secure yourself because you don't want to lose what you have. That's why we traditionally spoke about cybersecurity. But really, resilience brings really the perspective of you're not alone. You cannot just think of yourself. You are important for citizens, you are important for your supply chain, you are important for regulators, you're important for your clients, employees. So that's why you also have to be resilient. And when we speak in the context of financial institutions or any other critical infrastructure, then there is like very important societal benefit at stake. Is there do you see a direct link between the cyber resilience and the financial resilience of countries and of people?
Absolutely. So you mentioned that in your intro question. There is a very tight linkage between cyber resilience and financial stability. And anybody who's been sort of paying attention to this space, it's been talked about since 2018, probably even before. And anybody who is interested in this, anybody who is looking at DORA from either a policy perspective or from an implementation perspective, I personally find it really useful and helpful to go back to some of the earlier publications coming from the G20, the IMF, the Financial Stability Board. They're not massive documents. And I'm really encouraged to see that the people writing them are making a lot of effort to make them easy to apprehend, easy to understand. We're kind of going for plain English here. The reason it's important and I think helpful to spend some time reading those documents is because it gives context around why this is important. It gives context around why pieces of legislation like DORA have now materialized. And I find it helpful to focus not only on the implementation and the detail, but the spirit. What's the outcome? And that big picture view. So when you're talking about financial stability and you're talking about the societal impacts and the societal outcome, it's not just sort of esoteric and unusefully conceptual to talk about this. I think it's really important. It's really important to think about, where do we as individuals and teams and organizations, where do we sit in an ecosystem? And to understand the dependencies and the adjacencies. How do we touch other organizations? How do we interact with other organizations? And when we see, for example, policymakers in the financial services sector really hone in on this and put a lot of focus on it, it's because the risk of contagion is real. The risk of a cyber attack occurring somewhere in the financial services ecosystem and then setting off sort of like a chain reaction. It's a scary prospect. And people, myself included, we don't like thinking about catastrophic scenarios, but neither do we like being in them. And we're much better served to actually anticipate what those scenarios could look like. How might contagion occur? What type of cyber attack could strike in what portion of the financial services sector? And what might the ramifications of that be? Not a comfortable exercise, complex also in terms of trying to figure out what that scenario could be. But it's so important when we're talking about prevention and then response and recovery. None of us can get good at that unless we actually anticipate and train ourselves and put ourselves through the discomfort, but in controlled circumstances, so that if something and when something does happen, we've already prepared ourselves for it and we know what we need to do.
I find what you say very insightful. It seems maybe very obvious, but working both with the financial sector, so with large corporations, with a lot of resources and maturity in cybersecurity, as well as SMEs, like real small companies that come to me for first efforts in cybersecurity. What relates to both of them is you need the management, you need the people to understand the threat, the actual threat, and the actual issues they have to fix today, and how they understand it is not the usual video or a training you could deliver. Especially executives, they really need to feel it. They need to be in the situation to see the decision-making process, the challenges there are, and to then be able to anticipate. But with such a, let's say, more mature environment in the financial sector, we have a lot of stress tests for the financial side, so probably we have more experience. We do have relatively mature cybersecurity because that's where money are. That's what the criminals, cyber criminals were after for many years. What are still the challenges for the financial sector when it comes to cyber resilience, and are there opportunities as well?
So lots of challenges. And one of the things that I try to bring to my work and to the teams that I interact with and the individuals I interact with is trying to reduce that feeling of overwhelm, because it can feel sometimes a little bit hopeless, that there are constant attacks and technology that is serving adversaries is, getting more and more powerful. But we have to, turn up with the mindset of we're not going to be defeated and we can do the best we can with what we've got. So that's the mindset that I try to always bring for myself and for the people that I work with. What's the best we can do with what we have? And particularly what I think is helpful in terms of the regulation that's popping up in Europe, but all across the globe. We're seeing it in Australia, we're seeing it in the US, we're seeing it in different parts of Asia. There is more and more of a nudge coming from policymakers and regulators. It's a strong nudge, saying focus on what matters most. And I think that's one of the challenges that I'm seeing in organizations is working through the discomfort. And again, it's a human emotion, right? It's a reaction of discomfort. We want to feel safe. We want certainty. We want to be sure that we haven't left anything uncovered and we're not making any mistakes. we're going to make mistakes, right? We are. And nobody is infallible, but we just need to make sure that the mistakes we make are recoverable and that the impact is not terrible. So what I think is helpful right now is that nudge coming from policymakers saying, focus on the things that are critical. Focus on the things that drive your economic engine as a business, the things that will have a huge customer impact, societal impact if they go down. Other things, it's convenient when they're running well. But given that time and resources are limited, got to make choices and then be okay with those choices and go all in on backing them by action. So that's where I'm seeing sort of a difference between organizations who are progressing well at pace on this. They're the ones who are getting more comfortable with making those choices and getting enterprise-wide clarity about these are the critical business functions and the information systems and the information assets that are critical to us, and we're going to design around them. The ones who are still struggling a little bit or finding this challenging are the ones that have kind of an organizational, sort of a nebulous organization where different parts of the organization think that their part is critical. And that's, again, a natural human response. You work on something, you get kind of attached to it. But leadership in this, it's the cliche, but in every cliche, there's truth. Strong leadership, so important. Drive it from the top. It has to resonate that, you know, at the board level, in the C-suite, and then cascading down into the organization. We need clarity. And then from the clarity comes action, comes pace, comes velocity, and comes improvement. And there's just nobody ever died from too much clarity. You know, it's if we can get to a point where everybody knows what matters and can explain it in simple terms, that's when you know you're doing well. You know, if somebody is able to show up and talk about an incident response plan to a non-expert and make it super clear who's going to be doing what in what sequence for what purpose, you know you're in good shape. Right? So it's when we're able to talk about complex things in simple terms, we know we're on the right track.
Yes, very much. I agree with what you say. So this is the challenge, obviously clarity, but also an opportunity. Because with clarity, obviously security would be better if you know what you want to protect, how to protect it. But I imagine also the economic, let's say, performance of organizations would improve. So in that sense, security and cyber resilience measures are not just doing it for the security purpose. It really contributes to the business objectives and delivering these objectives in business level. Probably this is one of the main challenges still, is that much of the regulation comes in a very prescriptive way, at least in terms of financial sector regulation. And one example that we are all working on now is DORA, the Digital Operation Resilience Act that you mentioned. Being a very comprehensive piece of legislation that is going to be implemented across the EU, and sometimes with a different level of scrutiny, with a different level of guidance, but also with a lot of guidance still to come and specifications for a very short period now, starting next year of enforcement. Probably I highlighted some of the challenges, but how are firms responding to this regulation? Are they handling it well? Do you feel they are waiting for better times, or what is going on the sector from your perspective?
So I think this is regulation that's putting everybody a little bit under pressure, right? It would be disingenuous, and I don't think very accurate to say that anybody was finding this easy. With that said, I haven't heard anybody say that the outcome is not one that we should be pursuing, right? I haven't heard anybody say that we should not be, as an industry, pursuing more resilience. So there seems to be a broad consensus that the outcome is desirable. Getting there requires work. It requires consistency. It requires investment. There's effort involved. Now, like, you're totally spot on when you say, there's still detail to come, but the direction of travel is set, right? I think, that big objective on the horizon, that's clear. And while there are levels of prescriptive detail coming in DORA and in related regulation, I think firms would be wise not to say we're going to wait for all the detail and then, motor on ahead. There's enough detail to be able to put the big pillars in place. And one of the things that is taking a lot of time, maybe more time than firms anticipated, is how much conversation needs to happen in organizations. Because DORA is more of a team sport than I think any other regulation maybe. It requires multidisciplinary, multifunctional contribution, different skill sets. There is not a single team that has all of the answers on this, and it requires a step change in collaboration. So getting to know teams in organizations that you may not have relationships with, you may not be used to working with, all of that has to be put in place. How are we going to work together? Who needs to be around the table? And I think, again, different approaches. There are firms who are feeling very much under pressure and kind of going, okay, we'll just boom, boom, boom. We're going to try and, make a checklist and make ourselves feel a bit better about this. Other ones, and it's not necessarily correlated with size. That's one of the interesting things. You might think that the larger firms would be the ones with having the largest programs. Not necessarily. What I have seen is that firms who have what I would call enlightened leadership are seeing that there is a positive correlation between the types of capabilities needed to be good at DORA, to succeed in establishing a foundation for DORA compliance, and the capabilities that are needed to drive digital business success. So in terms of cybersecurity and data privacy capabilities, in terms of modernizing infrastructure, in terms of just general data capabilities so that you could, for example, have pervasive use of AI across your enterprise. All of these things that are core pillars of digital transformation, we also find them in DORA. And what I'm sort of encouraging firms to have as the mindset is not zero sum, which is we have to stop everything on our digital transformation because DORA is consuming all the resources. No, it's resilience as the foundation of digital business success. How can we make sure that we are satisfying our compliance obligations and at the same time also satisfying what we are trying to do in terms of our digital business ambitions? Because the other thing that we need to be mindful of is when financial regulators and banking supervisors in particular are looking at firms, they're evaluating not only their cyber resilience, their operational resilience, they're evaluating the viability of their business models. How profitable are you? How are you going to stay in business? So these things can't be taken one without the other. All of it has to fit together. And that's where this sort of approach of systems thinking. How can we serve both objectives at the same time by being smart in terms of the types of investments that we're making, the sequencing of investments and the roadmap that we're putting in place, and layering capability, because it's not going to be a one and done. This is an exercise in multi-year continual improvement.
Seems like a very complicated exercise. So already each piece individually is a challenge, and there is no handbook today that we can follow. We don't have experience with most of it. It's new things we have to face. But also the fact that combining this also, as you said, putting teams, different teams to work together, sometimes not necessarily very similar objectives or language or way of communication that could also make it very difficult. But when it comes to digital, you mentioned, so digital capabilities, of course, it contributes also to business being competitive on the market, interesting for customers, but probably also saving cost. Where do you place the cloud services in this equation? Is it more an opportunity, or it is, as we call it, friends or foes of cyber resilience?
So that's a super interesting topic, and I spend a lot of time on this. So what I think about in terms of financial services or just any complex environment, I'm always trying to figure out how can we go for positioning, because we can't control the external environment, but we can position ourselves so that no matter what happens, we're not constrained by our choices to make a bad decision because we've got no options. And what I see as the value in cloud is that it provides options. So what we're seeing more and more is that firms in the financial services sector, some of them have had and still have a platform-first strategy. More and more of them are focusing on being more nuanced, which means that they're having a workload placement strategy, workload-centric strategy. What are the characteristics of the workloads that they're operating, and where is the best place to operate them? So that could mean that for some workloads, on-prem is the best place to have them. For others, it will be a certain cloud service provider rather than another. But it's important to design for fast failover and design with the idea that at some stage, we don't really know what the reason might be, but at some stage there will be a disruption. How can we design up front so that there is many options as possible? And that's where I think cloud offers so much possibility and so much potential. Now, like any tool, right? It's sort of a tool in inverted commas. It all depends how you use it and how masterful, is an organization in understanding how a particular cloud service provider functions, the specificities of the services that they offer, and just being mindful that when you bring a third party into your fold, you need to manage the relationship. It's important, right? So it brings, and it's finding the balance. It brings lots of potential, technical optionality, resilience possibilities. It also brings the obligation for the relationship to deliver value and for it to be conducted in alignment with what regulators are stipulating now is the expectations around material outsourcing. Really important to have mastery, not just over the technical aspects or the architecture of it or the security. Vendor management, third-party relationship management is just as critical. So I see it as an amazing open door to building up capabilities and having choice. With choice comes the responsibility of making sure we're making sensible choices.
No, it's true that often the more choices we have, basically, the more adapted, obviously, the option for our cases. So it's good to have more offerings. But how can a company imagine would this be the IT manager, the CIO that would take this decision? How does the decision-making process go so that we make sure that whatever the one hand, let's say, development side, does the other hand, the resilience, the compliance side is also aware? How does it work in practice, and who starts first, basically?
So that's a great question. That is a topic that is still work in progress in the industry. And I wouldn't say that it's a solved issue. So what I've seen over the course of the past few years is that it's evolving. So typically, a cloud project or a cloud sort of transformation, it would often originate, with the CTO, CIO, that part of an organization. In some situations, particularly in financial services, right? So outsourcing to a cloud service provider requires sort of a non-objection, a kind of a tacit approval from a banking supervisor to be allowed to do it. And there have been situations where all of the right stakeholders haven't been involved necessarily, and things get slowed down. So firms learned by that, right? And I think what we're seeing, and again, regulation is providing a nudge on this because it's necessary to have these different internal stakeholders involved. The lead will probably still sit sort of with that CIO, CTO function, but with the wrapper and the support and the input coming from different parts of the organization where they are not brought in as an afterthought. They're brought in so that their input shapes the design. And I think that's super important, that the choices that are being made are risk-informed, threat-informed, regulatory-informed, and that when we're designing, we're thinking about these things, and that we don't find ourselves having to backtrack just when we actually want to go live because certain critical aspects have been overlooked. Now, people might think, oh, well, that's going to be slowing us down. The initiation of these types of projects, yes, it can feel heavy at the start, but it's there's so much more value that comes from doing the initiation correctly rather than powering through it and then realizing, oh, our foundations actually weren't that solid. So making sure that, to use the metaphor, I think from one of the business books of Jim Collins, is like getting the right people on the bus. It's super important to make sure that you have the right people on the bus and get people excited as well. You know, the use of cloud to drive a business transformation can be super exciting because we need to keep reminding people why we're doing it. It's not using cloud for the sake of cloud. It's using cloud to build something. Get people excited about what they're building and remind them of what they're building and why. And the why of what we do is so important. It's really easy to get sucked into details and arguments about technical things, and they're important. I'm not saying they're not. They are important. But every now and again, you know, once we've had another argument about what choice of HSM we're going to use, it's important to kind of lift your head and go, remember why we're doing this, people. Because my experience of projects that deliver, even when they're hard, is when people feel proud of what they're doing and they're excited about what they're doing. And particularly people who have an aspect of their personality that's about defending. I find that I have goosebump moments sometimes in meetings when I'm around people who work in security. They live this. And it means something very powerful to them. And I love being around people like that and giving them the opportunity to use that talent to actually make all of us safer. So when projects go well and people who have deep expertise on certain topics get to use it and get to contribute and get to build, those projects are the ones that are super exciting.
Very interesting. But now we really deep dived into the cloud, the cloud world and the innovation and transformation. But let me ask the question the other way around, so that we're back on the DORA topic and see how we discussed what is the cloud for DORA, but what is DORA for the cloud? Is the cloud reality changing? Is it getting more challenging to implement? Are there any breaks or yellow lights that we have to consider?
I think DORA is also, it's an opportunity, right? It's one of these things where in our personal lives and in our business lives and as companies, there are things that occur, and what we can always choose is how we show up. And we can either resist reality or we can embrace it and make the most of it. And I am hopeful that what we will see in our industry is that there is an expansion of a collective mindset And what I mean by that is that the things that need to be done are not seen as concessions. I'm not giving something away. I'm not feeling that this is a burden. I'm not feeling that this is something that is being laid on me and it's really, really tough and I don't want to do it. On the contrary, I think there is a way for us all to win. So it doesn't take away the profit motive of different firms operating in the sector. People are still, organizations and teams and people are still going to be competitive, and that's good. Let's keep striving. Let's keep getting better. But it's not because we're competitive that we have to compete on everything. So there are things where it makes sense to compete. And there are things where it makes sense to collaborate. And when we're talking about resilience and we're talking about sector-wide responses, for example, when we're talking about the ability to operate workloads for critical things and making sure that we can respond and recover, it makes sense to collaborate. And for me, this is a technical mindset, it is a mindset, a human mindset that will drive technical change. But it's a question of getting people who share a belief about what's important and building around that and still competing on other things. But we're only as strong as our weakest link. And, in this context, more than ever, so the saying is no man is an island. Well, we all have dependencies on each other. Clients have dependencies on their cloud service providers. Cloud service providers have dependencies on their own technology providers, their own supply chains. And I'm hopeful that we will start to see more and more that two things can be true at the same time. We can be competitive and also collaborative. And having both coexist is actually where there is huge value, and I think much better security outcomes and resilience outcomes. So making sure we're mindful about where we compete and making sure that we are open and transparent and collaborative, that we are sharing where it makes sense to share.
If I understand correctly here, you're referring to the cloud services that should, and probably there is a benefit for everyone if there's more collaboration on that side. Do you feel it's happening? Is that the reality, or this is for the moment a vision that you see?
I think it's work in progress. I think we are all learning by doing. We're seeing, again, the nudge, the impetus coming from policymakers and regulators. But we're beginning to see sort of sector-wide exercises. It's happening in the UK, it's happening in continental Europe. There's more and more activity and discussion around this in the US. So there are organizations that are kind of collective by nature. You talk maybe, for example, about FSISAC. Other organizations like the Cloud Security Alliance. It's bringing people together and having a forum where these types of topics can be discussed. And at our own level in IBM, we have the IBM Financial Services Cloud Council and community, where we bring different stakeholder groups that could be from sort of the CIO function, the risk function, the security function, some of whom are using IBM Cloud, some of whom are using other cloud providers. And that's what I think is really rich, is that we're not focusing on products and services, we're focusing on industry issues. How can we address operational resilience, this big elephant of a challenge, and break it into chunks that we can actually do something about? We've done work on testing, for example. So what I'm seeing is that there is two dimensions to this. People really, really curious to learn about what others are doing. Tell me what's working for you. What have you tried that's going well? What did you try that didn't go so well? And also having the possibility to feel sort of safety in numbers, that we're not alone. It's really powerful when people can actually have these sort of psychologically safe conversations where they reveal, yeah, we're struggling with such and such a thing. Are you too? Okay, good to know. We're not alone with that. So creating safe spaces where the real issues can get talked about and where people can share learning, I see a lot of generosity. I genuinely do. I see a lot of generosity of information sharing and knowledge sharing, people wanting to learn from their peers.
Yes, this is typically what we do in cybersecurity, right? We have to share vulnerabilities, we have to share threats, we have to share information. Otherwise, we are all losing the battle eventually, whether it's to a threat actor or it's simply complexities, right?
Absolutely.
IT systems, clouds, any, let's say, information system could sometimes become heavily complex, and that, as you said, does not help security or cyber resilience. So to wave away these shades, we need to speak to bring clarity. Very interesting thing you also mentioned is this. Okay, there are different industry forums. There are different ways to discuss one-to-one when you are in the position of a prospect, client, and supplier. But is there any guidance and support needed from regulators or authorities, European Commission, European Union, I don't know, ENISA, the Agency for Cybersecurity? What is their role? What can they do to actually help this, not only collaboration and sharing experience better, but also what is needed to improve the cyber resilience overall?
So what I'm seeing as, I wouldn't call it a gap. A gap sounds a little bit negative. An opportunity, right? There's an opportunity to provide examples of what good looks like, without it being prescriptive, without saying this is how you have to do it. But it kind of stimulates the imagination, and it helps firms overcome that fear of the blank page, which is, I have to come up with a strategy. I have to come up with an approach, and I don't know where to start. So the Financial Stability Board recently published a toolkit on third-party risk management. And it's a great starting point, sort of point people in the right direction. In terms of guidance, yes, I think that's helpful to have examples. It could be anonymized, it could be synthetic, but where authorities become aware of a good practice that's delivering results, share it. Now, there's always a fear of sort of, endorsing or prescribing. Yes, but there are ways of doing this. And I just, it's a recurring request. What are other people doing? What are other people doing? The other thing that firms have sort of iterated as something that they would find helpful is that they often find themselves in a situation where they are sharing information outwards. They're responding to consultations, they're filing regulatory reports, they're being supervised in an exam on site, for example. So they are giving a lot of information. What they would like is that there's also a flow of information back to them so that they know more about what's going on elsewhere in the sector. And finding a mechanism where there could be a dynamic, semi-dynamic representation of how the sector is kind of connected. And information flows, just so there's like a virtuous circle, I think, of information flows. And the other thing that I would really like to see more of, it's a criticism of nobody, it's just an observation, that different authorities have very specific mandates. They have sort of an institutional mandate that they take care of a certain remit, which is understandable and legitimate. What we're seeing, however, is that if you're in a bank or an insurance company or any firm in the financial services sector, you have multiple external stakeholders looking at specific topics. So your banking supervisor will be taking care of the organization as a holistic entity, but then there are others, that other stakeholder groups. So it could be ENISA or a national cybersecurity agency. It could be the agencies and authorities that are responsible for the enforcement of something like GDPR. And I would love to see more horizontal collaboration between the different authorities, providing horizontal guidance. And what I mean by that is authorities who are mandated to take care of data privacy and data protection, they look after that and they do a great job of it and they go deep on that topic. But if you're in a firm, you can't segregate topics, right? You can't say I have a bucket over here where I'm going to take care of operational resilience and a bucket here that's going to be cyber resilience and a separate siloed bucket that's going to be data protection. All of these things have to be bundled into a decision-making matrix so that you can actually get stuff done. And what's very challenging for firms is trying to figure out what are acceptable trade-offs in my pyramid of things that I have to take care of. What goes on top and what comes down? Now, it doesn't mean that things are unimportant. Nobody, to my knowledge, has ever said that data privacy and data protection is not important. But where does it sit in relation to operational resilience? And if there are trade-offs that you need to make, for example, this crops up, a very concrete example would be, you could design for resilience using a selection of hosting options. You could be on-prem and you could have a multi-cloud strategy using multiple cloud providers. However, while that will give you resilience in terms of being able to fail over in case of the disaster, it also means that you have geographically dispersed data. You may not want that. You may want to have sort of very localized data residency in a single country or in a single jurisdiction. That's a trade-off that you need to decide what is more important. And it's getting quite difficult for firms to make that appreciation on their own, because the guidance can be quite prescriptive coming from different authorities. And I would love to see that there is more practitioner level thinking, the next level down, which is, if we put this policy in place, then what? If we prescribe this, what happens then? And it's particularly when we're looking at things like sovereignty, without having a judgment call on whether it's right or wrong. It's just the thought process of, if this happens, then what? And are we happy to have more localized data residency and say it potentially would mean less resilience, but that's okay. That needs to be a choice and it needs to be intentional. So guidance coming horizontally so that all of these things get addressed in a manner where we can make operational decisions and make them with intention, that they're threat informed and that they're in alignment with the organization's risk appetite. That, I think, is one of the next steps of maturity for the industry.
Mm-hmm. I think we, as a, let's say, consultant industry, we are trying to fill this gap, looking at different regulatory requirements from perspective. Okay, we do security requirements in GDPR. So what does it mean for the security professionals? So then we probably some entities like the data protection authorities of France are very good in publishing information. They do their enforcement action at the end of the year. They say, voila, this is what we have done. This is what we have seen. This needs to improve, and we go in this direction. So this indeed is very interesting to kind of have the final conclusion. And so what, what is the information we gathered? What does it show? What indication it would bring to companies that they're okay, not okay, they're going in the right direction, before or under or above the threshold of the rest of the industry. Very interesting topic indeed, but probably it's already difficult in authorities themselves to get people to speak to each other, think about the different authorities with different objectives. That even seems even more complicated. But one element I would also wanted to pick up on what you said about best practices, right? Bring the best practices. We have lived this path in the EU. What we had in the beginning is every country wanted to do their thing. They were either very proud of what they're doing, but they didn't want others to, let's say, change it, or they
Yeah.
didn't have anything in place and they didn't want to speak about the
Yeah.
topic. So it was very difficult to move on together in a very fragmented environment with 20, back then 8 countries
Yeah.
doing different things. But indeed, one of the, from my observation, at least in the single market digital, what really helped us to work out together and to bring, let's say, the overall level higher is sharing these best practices. It's, again, it's not endorsement, it's not winning a prize.
Yeah.
It's just, do you do something well? Share
Yeah.
with the others. Did
Totally.
you have an issue that you think someone could have helped you with?
Yeah.
Share with others. I mean, there's probably dogma, of course, of doing things wrong or like making mistakes or struggling, but that is not bringing progress, not speaking about it. So for the interest of
Absolutely.
your own progress, ask for help, speak about your
Yeah.
issue, and move on. But again, Anissa also has very interesting overview of what NIS, for instance, Network
Yeah.
Information Security Directive, brought to industry. How companies responded, where did they spend basically money? Did they increase their budget for security? Where did they put their effort on, in which areas? With very interesting findings, which are sometimes surprising. So that means we do need to speak about it. It's not an assumption. It's not given, and you cannot know otherwise if we don't publish it. So I invite the financial authorities to look at what ENISA did in
Yes.
terms of publishing the whether it's overview of incident notifications. NISA
Yeah.
again had incidents. So which sector is targeted, what issues they face, is it growing, what is the trend basically? So then we know, as you said, more informed decision. We discussed the national regulators, but do you see any trade-off or any, how do you see the interplay between the EU and national authorities? Do you consider that the EU is now officially driving the cyber resilience discussion and rules, or do you feel that there is still a lot of margin and a lot of independence at national authorities to define their own game?
So I think from what I'm seeing, I'm going to have the humility to say that I don't have a sort of perfect visibility on this, but from anecdotal observations, I think national authorities, they have proximity and deep knowledge of the markets that they supervise. The reality is that this is kind of an all hands on deck moment, right? So I don't think it is the ambition of the European authorities to sort of, take control. And I think they're providing a very strong steer. But it's going to require that there is a strong mobilization across European institutions and then through the national competent authorities into the member states. Like I say, all hands on deck moment, because it's a big task that the industry is embarking on. And I think all of the skills and the expertise are required. So everybody learning by doing. And I don't think I'm doing the institutions and the authorities a disservice by saying they're also learning. This is a change in the type of risk, type of banking, financial services risk that they are supervising. We're not only talking about capital ratios anymore. It's not just about counterparty risk or market risk or liquidity risk. This is a very significant risk, and one that we're learning to manage a bit better.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much for this. I would like to conclude today. We have, I at least had a lot of food for thought. We can continue the discussion with you and Leslie, but everyone can comment on their take of the topic, on their own experience. We said sharing is important for bringing knowledge on the table, but also don't hesitate to check out our other videos, we have discussed the DORA, Digital Operation Resilience Act, in detail. What is it about? We've discussed other topics of vulnerability management. NIS was mentioned also. So you would find a lot of other interesting content. So subscribe to not miss a thing.